So the question is, I mentioned that there are, that you want to, at some point, sometimes in applications, you want to avoid doing lots of inserts into the DOM because they're slow, and it's sometimes faster to batch all of them together and do one insert. And the question that he's asking is whether there is some way to do that like a transaction. Is that what you're asking about, where you've got like, you know, that would be built into the framework where you're just like, okay, do this stuff, and when it gets to a certain threshold, like insert. Or maybe you just do it by hand, you say insert now. That's an interesting idea. I don't think there's anything like that built into Backbone, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a plugin or something that did it. Because that is a very common thing that happens is you've got individual pieces of your app that you need to do that with, and you don't necessarily want to do it on everything, right? Yeah.
I have a question about you. It sounds like you've played with Ember a little bit, and some of the other JavaScript frameworks like Knockout or Ruby or some of the others that use declarative bindings and automatically update versus the Backbone style having a render method that sort of is responsible for updating whatever needs to be updated.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts of comparing and contrasting those two approaches and what the pros and cons you've experienced are.
So the question is, could I talk a little bit about the difference between using a framework that has declarative bindings, which is basically just automatic updating of stuff in the view based on when you change an attribute on a model, versus the Backbone approach of kind of hand rendering things and needing to figure out yourself what order things get rendered in and when they need to be re-rendered. The Backbone rendering system, again, very flexible, but you can kind of, it does get a little unwieldy as you get several levels of nesting, and at that point with the rendering you generally need something more structured. So on most of the apps I've been on, we end up building something that's not quite data binding and declarative bindings, but it's somewhere like where if certain event is called, then we send another event out that is targeted to individual subviews that need to re-render themselves. And I think that, so the bindings that exist in Ember.js are convenient, but I didn't actually find that we used them that much. And maybe that was just, we've had one Ember.js project at Pivotal that I was on for about 6 weeks. And I actually spent the vast majority of that time during the 6 weeks trying to fix stuff when we pulled new stuff from Ember. Because it's changing so fast that every time you do a pull from the Ember repo, a bunch of stuff breaks. And to be fair, they're very good at like notifying you of which stuff is going to break, which is great, but you still have to fix it. And because they're changing how they think about things, and concepts are changing, ideas of where code is supposed to go are changing as they write the framework. And so I didn't feel like I got a whole lot out of that. That said, I think it's a good idea. I think that I haven't worked with a framework that really did it in a way that I felt was awesome. But I think that we're getting there, certainly. I like the idea of Ember a lot. I think that it's, as a Rails developer, it appeals to my sense of like trading flexibility for velocity, right? That's exactly what Rails is for. And, but it's not quite at the point yet where I can use it that way. I think, like I said, we're sort of in this odd place where everyone's got really great ideas about how this should work, but when you actually go to build an app, you run into things that they didn't think about, or I've been on a project where we were the first one to build an app that was of any significant size on the framework. That was not a good idea. Don't be that guinea pig. Although it is nice to be able to be like, hey, we need it to do this. And they'll be like, oh, okay, sure. Like the magic of open source, I suppose. Does that answer your question, or? Okay. You had a question here.
Talk a little bit more about dealing with messy APIs. You mentioned a new app, a way to go. A little bit more.
Sure. So the question was whether I could say something a little bit more about dealing with messy API situation. I think that So the two things that I described were you've got either a separate app that sort of handles that for you and handling it in your models. And having a separate app that deals with it is very appealing from a certain point of view because you're like, oh, okay, my JavaScript can stay nice and clean. I can just use these bindings. I don't have to worry about it. But when you do that, you are trading time in JavaScript for time in whatever server language you're doing, right? You're going to be spending a bunch of time in that application updating the bindings when something random happens on one of the APIs. And for me, I tend to prefer that solution just because I'm still more comfortable with Ruby than I am with JavaScript. And I have a much better idea of like how to manage complexity in a Ruby web application than I do of managing complexity in JavaScript. So since I'm coming from that perspective, I tend to prefer I will put an app up and I will have this nice interface that Backbone is expecting and then everything will be happy. So the other thing I think that's interesting about that is that you don't necessarily know what all of your models are ahead of time, right? The set of models, Backbone models, right? The set of Backbone models that you want evolves over time. And so when you change the set of Backbone models, sometimes that means you need to then change your API application to reflect that, which is sort of another level of changes. And it's always more work to update two apps than to have it all in one place. So I think there are good things and bad things about both approaches. If you have it all in the JavaScript and you start noticing patterns over time, it may be easier at that point to, again, construct another little piece of scaffolding around Backbone that deals with that. A couple of people asked whether it was possible to just completely change out the piece of Backbone that does the AJAX calls out and parses the data that comes back in, so that if you are dealing with a different format, it can just do it for all the models. And my answer was it's theoretically possible. I've never done it. And I'm not really sure what that would involve. Has anyone tried that? Yeah. You have? Yeah, I was thinking, so he said you could define the parse method, which you can totally do. Although what I was thinking is it would be nice to be able to do that maybe for all models or some set of models or something. I guess you could define it redefine it on the prototype of Backbone view, or Backbone model rather. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He says he's overridden the sync method to talk to a local web SQL database rather than to make an AJAX call, and it seems to work. So it sounds like that's a possibility if you've got a very consistent set of like these models always need to have this type of parsing. My experience when I'm working with a set of APIs like this, though, is that often there's not a lot of patterns in it at first, because you'll need to do a couple of different API calls to get the stuff you need, and then for this one you need a different set of API calls to get all the data you need. And then, if you're working with something that is regular but just isn't REST, that sounds like it's a good option. But a lot of times with these messy APIs, it seems like you're dealing with stuff that maybe wasn't necessarily designed with your application in mind, was designed with a completely different consumer in mind, so it doesn't return the set of data you really need. So when you're in that situation, I think it's harder to override it all at once for everything. There's Theo to comment.
There's two arguments that I would make in favor of using the server side way of cleaning things up. And one of them is it's more modular. You've got the same amount of code that's in two different places, so that each one of them is going to be individually smaller. The other is that if you do it on the server side, then over time you have a chance of cleaning up your server and integrating that stuff back into the mainline server code if you decide to. Whereas if you put it all into your client, then you're kind of stuck with it.
Interesting. So the comment was that when you split it out into a separate application, it is more modular, it's more separated. You've got, all of the icky stuff in one place, so to speak. And the other argument was that you could, in theory, if you have this little application, you might be able to push some of those changes back to the originating APIs over time. I think that in a lot of the projects that I've been on where I was in this situation, even if I implemented all the stuff in the client, there's sort of a separate negotiation process that goes on with whoever owns the APIs. Like assuming they're in some other division of the company or whatever, so we got to have meetings and whatever. So I think in either case, in my experience anyway, you end up, you do end up pushing some of the changes you want back, if under good circumstances anyway. A lot of times, though, the reason I'm doing it is mostly just for velocity on the JavaScript side. Right? I don't want to deal with exceptions and things that aren't in the norm for JavaScript, for Backbone rather. And in that case, I would probably rather that the APIs didn't change because then I don't have to update my server. But I have been on projects also where we wrote a client against a huge Java API server that we never even looked at. And then when we were done with that, they were like, hey, can you rewrite our server for us too? And we were like, oh my God, we spent all this time putting in this layer of stuff, and if you just told us about this 6 months ago, we could have avoided all that work. So, I think that the negotiation among different code owners is one of the most difficult parts of my job, at least from my perspective. Writing code, easy. Dealing with people, hard. And especially making them do something that is not necessarily in their best interest or doesn't really get them anything. So it's definitely a hard problem, making updates to the APIs. Yeah. So the question was, if you've got an application that's already doing server-side rendering and you want to start moving towards client-side, how do you attack that problem? And that's a good question. Usually I try and find something in the UI. There's always something driving it, right? There's something where you make some change and the product people are saying, oh, when you make that change, update this counter over here also, or put up this window, or whatever it is. And so it's usually driven by some particular feature that hopefully is relatively well contained. I mean, on the projects I've been on, it's been driven by something sort of specific. They were like, okay, we want to be able to, whatever that is, right? We want to be able to not do page refreshes anymore. So let's start with this one. Let's get rid of this one. And then it's pretty easy to be like, oh, okay, well, I'll just, we'll redo all of this server-side templates in Mustache, and then we'll make a view for this thing. And so you can replace it sort of piece by piece. I guess it just depends on what you do first, in my experience, depends on, from the product perspective, what's most important to them, really. Although if you've got free reign to start wherever you want and your only directive is make it more Web 2.0-y, I would tend to start with something like the nav bar, something that's almost always there. Because that can drive out a lot of issues with what connects to that, what needs to talk to that. And that can give you a good idea of where the natural component boundaries are. I think part of the problem when you're converting an existing app is it's sometimes not really clear where those component boundaries are supposed to go. Right, on the wireframe, it's really easy, right? This box and that box and that box. But in a real app, sometimes it's not that easy to really tell where the component boundaries are and where they should be. So, so doing something that is always on the page or is nearly always on the page sometimes drives out some of those component decisions, at least at the higher level. And then when you start implementing those objects, you can look down and hopefully it starts to become clear where the boundaries are within each object as you're working on it. Oop. Yes?
I was wondering if you had any comments specifically geared towards security and with client-side applications. Because from my perspective, there's no reason why you should ever trust the client.
Mm-hmm.
How does that change your approach to building an application, especially for the client side?
So the question is a question about security. So if you don't trust the client, you're never supposed to trust the client, right? Does that change how you write the application? It's an interesting question. I think that there are levels of trust, I guess. There are, if someone is logged in, so they've got a cookie, that's one thing. If someone's a guest, that's something else. And there's a lot of different pieces to that question. I guess the main thing that's different between writing a server-side API or a server-side rendering app and a client-side rendering app from a security perspective is how do you, for example, Rails requires you to send in this token when you submit a form, which means that you can't submit from curl, right, or whatever it is. Anything that's going to make a change, like a post or a put, you have to include this token. Otherwise, it won't do it. And so one of the things that we commonly deal with in Backbone apps is okay, should we turn that off? You can, not recommended. We could turn that off on the server side. Or we can figure out some way of pulling the token is in the header somewhere. We can pull it out. We can send it with every AJAX request. I think the authentication tends to be a little bit different. A lot of the auth libraries are written assuming that it's like a normal submit the form, refresh the page kind of deal, because it sets cookies and does a bunch of other stuff. So authentication, at least in Rails, using AJAX is still kind of a pain. And on a lot of applications, we end up doing the login as a page refresh, and then everything else is the one-page app. So you're logged in, and then everything's awesome. But until you get there, you're still in Web 1.0 land. I can't really think of other differences necessarily. I mean, the only difference from the server-side perspective is that you are outputting different types of things you're outputting JSON instead of you're outputting HTML. And so it seems like all of the same issues that apply to a server-side rendering app essentially still apply. Don't let them SQL inject your stuff, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff is all the same. I guess you don't have to be. Some of that stuff does move to the client, right? Because stuff where you have a piece of JavaScript that's in a string and you just put it in the page, whatever user input stuff, cross-site scripting and things like that, that can still happen, and you have to deal with that on the Backbone side, right, with proper escaping and so on. And that's a good point actually, is that some of the frameworks, at least Rails, takes care of a lot of that escaping and blah 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 and all that stuff for you in the views rather in the HTML. And so that's an interesting pitfall where you have to start doing it yourself and thinking about it explicitly rather than depending on the Rails view helpers.
So Backbone doesn't give you any sort of advantage with security in that regard?
No. So the question was whether Backbone gives you any kind of advantage in security. I don't think it does necessarily. It certainly doesn't have anything built in that deals with that kind of stuff. Yeah. How do I organize Backbone components to target different devices? Mm-hmm. So the question was how do you deal with choosing which views to use based on whether it's a mobile device or a desktop browser. Honestly, I haven't done a whole lot of that because most of the apps that I've been on, one of the reasons that my clients tend to have an API already is because they've already got some native mobile app that's using it, right? Or they want to, we've seen a lot of clients start to come in with, they want to build a mobile app and a website at the same time, right? So the reason that they want to build a client-side app is partially just because they want to build one server app that will deal with the native mobile client and the website. And in general, on sites where I did have to have a significant mobile presence, I haven't really used the Backbone stuff that much. So usually we have a fairly early user agent switch that's like, oh, you're on mobile, I will send you over to my special mobile site, rather than putting them onto the Backbone site. I'm not sure, has anyone else used Backbone like actually on a mobile device to render views on a mobile device? Yeah.
I don't my experience mostly after this question because it's solely a mobile site, but I've used using Backbone on a mobile offline web app.
Using Backbone on a mobile offline web app, which is like all the buzzwords rolled into one. That's awesome. Congratulations. Any other questions? We can break early. Yeah.
What happens when you have a project that then evolves, like phase one of a project completes, user acceptance testing goes up wonderfully, everybody's done, happy, yay, clap, clap. Then you get the inevitable follow-up request for like, take something like the messaging application. So somebody says, oh, we're doing a major social networking push. We also want to take all of the tweets from the company Twitter account, and we also want to feed them into this. How do you deal with when you start having to build on top of a backbone app that had in functionality that you didn't necessarily have planned the first time around? When you're trying to develop it underneath rather than underneath.
So the question is, if you're dealing with a Backbone app that is in more maintenance mode rather than in greenfield development mode, how do you deal with, I guess, changing requirements and changes to the code base, basically, that you weren't anticipating when you first wrote the app? And I think that that's a good point. I think one of the things you're pointing out, right, is that maintenance mode of an app is a very different thing than the original development push. It feels different. You generally have different developers in many cases, not always. And sometimes there's not a lot of continuity between the people that originally wrote the code and the people who are maintaining it now. And so I think that in maintenance mode, a lot of the same sort of working with legacy code stuff applies, right? You need to make sure that it's got good tests, understand changes you're making, do the refactorings that need to be done as you encounter them. I guess my strategy is to try and, as a consulting firm, now this is probably a little bit different than what people at product companies, how they think about this, but my goal with the code is to make it really easy to change, right? Because most of the clients I'm dealing with are sort of in the early process of their product creation, right? So stuff changes constantly, right? They take different directions, we take a U-turn, we start building something completely different, happens more often than you'd expect. We just basically Rails new and stop working on the old code. And so I did work at product companies for a couple of years, though, and what I found is that it's really important to do incremental refactorings as you encounter them, right? If you see something that is named wrong, or you see a function that's in the wrong place, or you see something that's like slightly not what it should be, even if that's not exactly what you're working on, sometimes it's important to like fix that kind of stuff as you go along, which makes it so that you have fewer of these like, I can't do that, the code's not designed for that, right? Because part of the problem with a maintenance mode app is that you may not know all of the decisions that originally went into building it. And I sort of forgot where I was going with that. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. But I think that a lot of the software engineering practices that we apply to maintenance mode in a server app apply equally well to a Backbone app, right? Keep it, do the refactorings as you see them, keep the code in good shape, make sure your test coverage is high, et cetera, to make it as easy as possible to make changes. Yeah. The question is, could I quickly describe the difference between unit testing and integration testing? I think you asked 3 people that question, I think I get 3 different answers. But the way I think about it is that unit testing is me calling individual functions within an object and asserting on what happens. And integration testing is the entire app is up and instantiated, including whatever data stores on the back end need to be there. And I'm doing things that exercise all of the layers of the application. So if it's just a Backbone app, that means something that exercises all the way up to the AJAX barrier, basically. If it's a web application that includes a server component that I'm in charge of, then integration testing is often like everything from Backbone all the way through to the database and back, right? And the way that I think about it is that I want to have good, I really like integration tests personally. I like having them as a way to look at the tests and understand what the app is supposed to do, sort of at a very high level. But I don't like that they're really slow. And I like to have tests that run fast because I like other developers to run them. And just like, if it takes an hour to run the test suite before you check in, you'd never do that, right? So the way that I tend to balance it is I try and do the test at as low a level as possible. Right? If you think of integration testing, and then there's a lot of different layers, right? Unit testing being the most granular. And then I try and make sure that each interface is sort of tested as you go along. And then for integration tests, I like to have at least sort of a set of happy path tests that run through whatever the most important flow in the application is to make sure it works. So whatever, if it's a shopping cart, make sure that you can buy something. Right? Whatever it is that's most important in your app, I think it's very useful to at least have integration tests that cover that. Because I have had integration tests find regressions. And usually what that means is that there's a hole in my unit test coverage somewhere. Right? If an integration test actually catches something, that means that I've got other test holes somewhere that I need to find. So I try and do as much unit testing as I can. Now in Jasmine, there are different ways to use it. You can use it sort of as a unit testing thing, which is sort of what I was showing on the slides. You can also use it as a more integration testy thing, where you've got the entire, maybe you've got the entire page view and all of its subviews that you render, and then you poke at it to see what happens. And there are various schools of thought, even within Pivotal, on whether that's a good idea, right? Whether you use Jasmine as an integration test or whether you just want to sort of very narrowly focus your Jasmine specs on unit testing. And so for a lot of people, one of the frustrations with Backbone is that it does make you do sort of more integration testy type things that are supposed to be unit tests. So it's sort of an open question, I think, as to what the right balance is there, and it certainly will vary by project too. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. What is it about Backbone that makes it do more integration testing?
Because the event callbacks, for some reason, can't be mocked. So you need to test, like in order to test the events, you poke at the UI and provoke the DOM event, whatever it is, and then you have to like look and see what happened, right? Look into the DOM and see if what happened was supposed to happen, which is sort of an integration test kind of way to test that kind of thing. I mean, ideally what you'd like to be able to do is say, okay, I triggered this DOM element. Did it call my callback? I don't care what the callback does. All I want it to do is make sure it calls my callback. Right, at that level, that's all I care about. And then separately, I will test to make sure that when I call the callback, it does the right things. And so I would like to have that separation in my unit tests. But someone mentioned sign-on. I don't know if you're still here. But that is an add-on for Jasmine that has better mocking than Jasmine Core. So I'm interested to have a look at it. That might solve that problem, actually. Yeah. That's one endorsement for Sign-On.js as a test accessory, I guess. Maybe we could pull some of that into Jasmine Core if it works better. That would be awesome. Yeah.
So a couple of times you referenced how good Backbone was for migrating from an existing server-side app to the client-side app. What do you think about the idea of actually building maybe a simpler version of your server-side app first? I mean, I noticed in your GitHub app that you used in the beginning, it looked like a simple Rails scaffolded app. Do you think that's a reasonable way to start? Or?
You mean to sort of build the API that you want as a separate application? That's an interesting question. So the question was, if you're migrating an existing app, would it be worth essentially at the same time writing a new server, I guess? I think that's definitely the ideal case. I think that a lot of times it's valuable to have both live together, actually, because a lot of times when product folks request some of this interactivity, sometimes they don't really know if their user base is going to like it, or basically they want to be able to introduce things gradually, new interactions gradually, rather than having to do the grand reveal of the new site. And it's much easier, especially for A/B testing and stuff like that, to be able to have both in the same app. I've been on projects where we developed the API and the client at the same time. And those are fun because I can make the API whatever I want, right? Doesn't matter. I can change it. But I think that for a lot of people, there's business value in having both live together for a while. And certainly you could do something where well, I'm not sure you could do this, where you could, if you wanted to, you could have the separate API app, reverse proxy through the normal app so that you could have some stuff that comes from that and some stuff that comes. There's ways you could do it where you could have both live together, like a new app and the old app. I'm not sure that it's worth the complexity, though. I guess it depends on the project. I feel like a lot of the answers I'm giving is, it depends. Which, I am a consultant, but also I don't know. This is true. It's a lot of, projects are so different. Although it's not really sometimes I feel like I should be more controversial and put a line in the sand. And then maybe people would tweet more or something, I don't know. Yeah.
You mentioned you had a framework for sub-views that you open sourced. Did you say the name of that?
I don't think it's been open source, actually. I may have misspoken. Although, actually, it might be. So the project, that project is called Chorus, which is a big data application that they are open sourcing this summer, I think. I'm not sure exactly what the timeline is on that. But they made a big announcement that they're going to open source it. So actually, sorry? So Chorus is done by a company called Greenplum, which is a big data. Basically, they sell a really souped-up version of Postgres and for big data analysis. And Chorus is the web app that runs on top of it that lets you collaborate with people working with different data sets. And we wrote that web app, and then as a result of that, Greenplum's parent company bought Pivotal Labs. So we're now like under the same umbrella and owned by the same company, which is a little weird. So apparently now Chorus is like a Pivotal product. But so I should probably know more about it than I do, but I know the plan is to open source it sometime this summer. Sorry? Chorus, like Chorus. And the company that is releasing it is called Greenplum. Yeah, question in the back, sorry. I didn't hear that the URL is, it sounds like you've open sourced a Backbone plugin that does. Mm-hmm. Sounds like it has subview integration. What was the URL? Gotcha. So it's GitHub's, and the username is Hautelook, Hautelook. Did I get that? Yay. Okay. They've got apparently a Backbone plugin framework thing that does subview rendering. Might be interesting to look at. Yeah. Interesting question. So the question is, if you've got, how do you, the way Backbone, the way that I usually use it is that I have it do as many API calls as it wants until it becomes a problem. So what he was asking is like, how do you optimize for big lists of things so that you're not constantly refetching them? So if you go from one page where you've got a huge list of things and you go somewhere else, then you come back, how do you make sure you don't have to fetch all of those things again? Is that the question? So a lot of times if I've got a view that looks like that, I will do the trick where I cache the view in the DOM, hidden, and then just show it again. And then I have a trigger so that when it's shown again, I go out and I get the changes, whatever changes there are. Right? So I give it a timestamp basically, and I'm like, give me the changes since this timestamp. And then I update that list. It can also work if it's just a user interaction problem that they don't want to wait for the list. It can also work to just show the list you have, and then meanwhile kick off a process that goes and fetches it again and then updates the list once it comes back. It depends on whether it's like my server is too busy, it's getting hammered with all of these requests problem, or it's a user interaction problem that you're dealing with, where there are things you can do in the UI to make it feel more responsive even when you're doing the same set of API calls. So the question is whether there's something in Backbone that will deal with the caching stuff. No, not that I know of. Usually it's one of those bits of plumbing that gets built up in a project over time if you need it. I know GitHub does it. I don't know if they've open sourced that or not. Probably not. But that's part of their new API but their new site that they rolled out a few weeks ago. Or might be longer ago now. But it basically they just cache all the pages as you move from, as you're navigating a repo, and then they just slide them back in when you hit back or go to this URL. So they just have all the stuff hanging out in the DOM, which is pretty interesting. Sure. the question is, if you're caching a lot of data, do you start seeing slowdowns on the client side? Definitely. Definitely. I think that, you know, it's different with each app as to how much you feel like you can push it, right? Depending on the profile of your users and what kind of machines they have. And, you know, on a lot of the apps that I've worked on, you know, we could assume, you know, IE7 and up and et cetera, which is a little bit of a better profile than some of the other apps that I've worked on in the past. And, you know, with that, you can assume a little bit about their machine, but then you have another problem, which is mobile. If you're you know, serving mobile from the same site, do you change how you, yeah, there's a lot of stuff to write yourself or find plugins to do in that area if you get to that point. Yeah.
Possible for you to show us like where, let's say for the templates, that you want to write some additional code so that you can select out to use particular templates for particular given a particular set of conditions, probably based on model data.
Mm-hmm.
That you're getting back. Exactly where would something like that go?
So the question is, if you have, if the template you want to use with a particular model depends on something, where do you put that code? The answer is there's no right way to put it. Like right place, you can put it wherever you want. But one thing that seems to work well is that you can actually make the template directive that you, or template property that you pass into the view, that can be a function. So you can actually, rather than just having it be a static, like this is the thing that I want you to use, you can actually have it just return conditionally so that it runs each time someone asks for the template. So basically, that's actually an interesting point. Basically any property in Backbone that is usually just a property can almost always be a function as well. So anything that you, like if you want the class name to be conditional based on whatever else is in the DOM, you could have the class name property be a function that looks at something and makes a decision based on that. So basically any of the properties that you pass into the views can also be functions, which is part of the magic of JavaScript, is anything can be a function. It's awesome. Okay, well thank you very much for sticking around to the bitter end.